Interesting. Then when it came to my dealings with Iraq in the 80s, they came back to me. Spy for us. Saddam Hussein has the most efficient and ruthless counterintelligence people in the world. I was supposed to go into Baghdad, off to the arms plants, highly sensitive Iraqi military installations, and spy for Britain, the hated imperialist power. And I did. Not out of self-interest, not for reward, certainly not. I happened to believe in my country. And what thanks did I get? A VC? Afraid not. They humiliated me. They arrested me and put me behind bars like a common criminal. Well, of course, the trial collapsed. But by then, my business was ruined. My plant closed down and 600 more jobs went in Coventry. Good jobs, good people. What was wrong was they let this prosecution go ahead. And when it did, they tried to say they knew nothing about it. It all came as a complete shock to them, and what a wicked person I was for giving comfort to the enemy. I'm going back into business now. Those 600 engineers aren't. That's what annoys me. And my pride, of course.
Mr. Cobb, good morning. Thank you very much for sending us your statement, which we have, of course, read with great interest. Miss Baxendale on my left will be mainly asking you some questions arising from it. I may ask you some myself.
Mr. Gore-Booth, please can I confirm that you were Assistant Under-Secretary of State, Middle East at the Foreign Office from January 1989 to the end of December 1992?
I can indeed confirm that.
Can I ask you about asking questions in Parliament? If there is a question, it should be fully answered, should it not? I mean, the answer should be sufficiently full to give a true meaning.
Well, a question should be answered so as to give the maximum degree of satisfaction possible to the questioner.
I'm not sure you really mean that, because that's rather like people just giving you the answer you want to hear, I think is what you've just said. I don't think you quite mean that.
No, it might be the answer you don't want to hear.
That does not give you much satisfaction. Should the answers be accurate?
Of course.
And they should not be half the picture.
They might be half the picture. You said, should they be accurate? And I said, yes, they should.
On a more broad approach to answering questions, there'd be nothing the matter with an approach that proceeded on the footing that you would, in every case, be as forthcoming as you could.
Oh, correct, but there are often cases in which you cannot be so forthcoming. For reasons of what are called foreign policy.
It's a question of where you start from. If you start from the view that you're going to be as forthcoming as you can, you'll have a very good reason for holding something back.
Well, it is very much for a minister to decide how to answer a parliamentary question, and then for the civil servants to draft it. So the extent to which an answer should be full, half full, or empty is very much a ministerial decision.
But Lord Glenarthur's answer in the House of Lords on the 20th of April 1989 does not really set out the full picture, does it? With the sentence, British arms supplies to both Iran and Iraq continue to be governed by very strict guidelines preventing the supply of lethal equipment to either side.
That is a correct statement.
Notwithstanding the decision to be more liberal in the approach for applications for exports for Iraq.
I think the statement, as made by Lord Glenarthur, is absolutely correct, given that it had been decided that there would be no announcement of the modification of the guidelines. That seems to me to be an entirely appropriate response.
But you say that the original Guideline 3 is still in place.
It is kept under constant review and applied on a case-by-case basis in the light of the prevailing circumstances, including the ceasefire.
But that is completely ridiculous, is it not? In the light of the fact that it has been amended for Iraq to completely different words.
I don't think so at all. We come back to the point of whether you think the British public and Parliament are so dumb as to realise there has not been a ceasefire.
You certainly can't have known what the revised wording was.
Indeed not, but it had been decided not to make a public announcement.
Is it not completely misleading?
I do not think so at all.
Can I suggest that, in fact, for various policy reasons, there was a view that the House of Lords should not be told that a more relaxed attitude had been adopted in respect of Iraq?
Yes, it had been agreed there should be no public announcement, and that is what happened.
Why should that not have been announced?
Because there are all sorts of reasons why the Iraqis were not very popular. even though they were slightly more popular than the Iranians.
There would have been domestic upset because of the chemical warfare.
Kurds, chemical warfare, and so on the one hand. And also that we were trying, rather unsuccessfully, I admit, to establish and maintain a relationship with Iran. Now, of course, one of the factors that would have complicated that would be the Iranians knowing that we were giving the Iraqis a slightly better treatment than the Iranians were getting, and that there was a myriad of foreign policy reasons tucked away.
So rather like you were saying the British public are not idiots. Presumably neither are the Iranians.
Well, that is a very hazardous statement.
I would not have thought so. If they'd just issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, and there's an enormous political upset going on about it, would they not be surprised to discover that maybe the British government was favouring to some extent the Iraqi government?
The Iranians are not people who think in very logical terms. They thought the fatwa was perfectly justified and we shouldn't have reacted to it at all.
I'm now going to the consideration of the Matrix Churchill export licence applications at the beginning of 1989. And what you need is MOD 24, Volume 1. It's page 72A. This document sets out the view of defence intelligence. Then the document refers to Houtin, described as the main ammunition manufacturing plant in Iraq, and to NASA, capable of producing 500,000 artillery rounds of assaulted calibers annually. Defence intelligence says that if this information had been available originally, the export licenses would not have been granted. Do you think it would have been useful to have known about this intelligence?
When I was discussing my travel plans with the doctor in Riyadh before coming, he referred me to something called a retrospectroscope, which you stick into people, and it enables you to look backwards. You are drawing me down the track of trying to look backwards in the light of information which we now have, which we did not have at the time. I am reluctant to get drawn too far down that track.
Well, I think you have to rely upon me to make a fair use of your answers. Of course, I understand that you're being asked to look back. Can you answer the question?
Well, if we had known then what we know about Iraqi arms procurements now, and if we had known then that Saddam was intending to invade Kuwait, I dare say the decision would have gone differently. Of course, my own view at the time was that it should have gone differently.
Now, I was going to move on. You'll be delighted to hear we're moving on to another section. We're whizzing through sections now. Now, I would like to ask you about a parliamentary question. It's directed to DTI ministers and sent to the Foreign Office for clearance. It's MOD 40/3. And it's page 293. The 7th of November, 1989. To ask the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry what investigations his department has undertaken into the Matrix Churchill Company and the possibility that the company is supplying parts to Iraq which could be used in ballistic missile production. The answer given is, I have no reason to believe that the company has contravened UK export controls. The response is not an answer to the question, is it?
I think you must put these questions to those more concerned.
It is not an answer to the question, is it? It is an evasion of the question. The answer to the question would have been an extremely embarrassing one.
It must eventually be for ministers to decide the terms in which they answer parliamentary questions.
To be a Kurd is to be at war. Sometimes it seems every nation in the world takes it in turn to try and destroy us. This is maybe lucky. If they stop for a week, we try to destroy each other. There was a time that whenever Turk fought Persian, Iraqi fought Turk, it was always Kurdish blood was spilt. We tried to stop fighting each other, and to stop fighting as mercenaries in other people's wars. We began to unite, to behave like a nation. Since 1985, Saddam has tried to wipe us out. In 1987, Saddam sent his cousin, Majid, the one he later sent to govern Kuwait. He was to Arabize Kurdistan. 4,000 villages were demolished. 500,000 Kurds sent to protected camps, many out of our country. Whole areas were prohibited, emptied. Any person or animal in them was shot. Artillery, helicopter gunships, jet planes were used against us. Then Majid ordered chemical warfare against us. Mustard gas and nerve gas, the worst of all. Men, women, and children are left with a film over their eyes. Out of their nose and mouth comes a horrible slime. Their skin peels. It bubbles up. On the 16th of March, 1988, Iraqi planes flew over Halabja. They dropped cyanide, mustard, and nerve gas. 5,000 people died this horrible death. Nearly all of them were civilians. They died because they were born Kurdish. Your government knew about this. Yet your government allowed your countrymen to help these unspeakable people to make the shells they fired, even the bombs they dropped the chemicals in. Do you have a word in English for that?
Mr. Wardegrave, please can I confirm that you were Minister of State at the Foreign Office from July 1988 until November 1990?
That's right.
You say in your statement to us that it was important that the policy of restraint in defence sales to Iran and Iraq, and indeed other countries in the region, was understood. And if there had been a change in the policy, Parliament should normally be told. Did you think it was important that Parliament, and through it the public, should know about the guidelines?
Yes.
There had been for very many years within the Foreign Office internal guidelines as to the manner in which export applications relating to defence equipment should be dealt with, indicating the importance to be given to the human rights record of the country concerned, the military capability and so on. What was the difference that prompted the 1985 guidelines?
I guess. I'm now out of my period, but I think the Iran-Iraq war was turning out to be a really major war. It wasn't just an incursion. Persians and Arabs had been squabbling with each other for 8,000 years, but this was turning out to be a very major war, with hundreds of thousands of people killed, though it's notable there isn't much debate. In terms, I remember, of parliamentary interest, there were far more debates, for example, about Cambodia, and there wasn't much we could do about that either.
There were quite a number of questions arising out of the atrocities.
Well, I'm not saying there was no interest. When there was some frightful horror, like gassing of Kurds, like a variety of horrors that went back beyond my time, actually in the conduct of the war, and in the awful things that happened immediately after the war, there was indeed interest.
And that's one of the reasons why Parliament should be told. If MPs don't agree with a policy, it can be discussed, it can be debated in Parliament.
I guess so.
There was a paper prepared by the Foreign Office. The intention was it should go to the Prime Minister. Subject: implications of a ceasefire for defence sales to Iran and Iraq.
This seems to me contemplating relaxing restrictions, letting through things that would otherwise have been refused.
The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, says that we don't want to have a great shaboozle in public, which is then going to cause a bad signal to Iraq, which has been behaving extremely badly.
If we go to the Foreign Secretary's comments on defence sales, he says he's reluctant to put this paper forward. He feels it would look very cynical if so soon after expressing outrage over Iraqi treatment of the Kurds, we were to adopt a more flexible approach on arms sales. It's clear that the Foreign Secretary did not think the paper should be circulated.
Right.
Then there's a letter of the 4th of November from Mr. Clark to you. It says, concerned about a large number of licence applications for export of dual-use equipment for Iraq and Iran, he refers to the harm that is being done to British industry. Then he says, I recognise, of course, that whatever is agreed between us will require the Prime Minister's approval.
Yes.
All this correspondence between you and Alan Clark is copied to the Prime Minister, isn't it? And that's presumably because of an earlier comment from her private secretary saying that the Prime Minister wanted to be kept closely in touch with it.
Sorry, I don't expect you to understand this extremely well, but silence is an important event when you're circulating things to other ministers. And I think the lack of comfort from on high means something too.
I'm not quite sure what that means. If ministers' correspondence goes to the Prime Minister and there is silence, that doesn't mean anything at all.
All that it can be taken as meaning is that the argument will continue.
The point remains open.
The point remains open.
Are you saying the new wording covering exports to Iraq was never used? Or are you saying because it never went to the Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, and it was not announced, the guidelines were never changed.
It is perfectly clear the guidelines were never changed.
There is a problem about this which has been keeping me awake at night. The proposition that seems to come from your paper to the inquiry is that the guidelines were announced in 1985. The guidelines could not be changed without a proposal going to senior ministers, the Prime Minister, being announced in Parliament. None of these things ever happened. Ergo, the guidelines were never changed.
To accept that is the only argument. You have to believe that Whitehall is basically honest, which I do believe.
But surely the most important thing is what they're doing.
Absolutely.
The policy you're operating is not what you say, it's what you do.
We kept saying to each other, you cannot agree these revised guidelines until they have gone up to number 10, and goodness knows what.
What happens next is the fatwa on the 14th of February 1989.
There was a tilt in favor of Iraq as a result of the fatwa.
You said that after the fatwa, I think you said no one referred to the revised wording of the guidelines again.
You have clearly shown me from the documents that this is wrong. If you, Sir Richard, have been worrying about this at night, you can imagine that I have, because it is jolly important to me. And I've come to the conclusion that we did not do wrong.
There was a Ministry of Defence paper from Mr. Barrett saying, Mr. Wardegrave is content for us to implement a more liberal policy on defence sales without any public announcement on the subject.
It is not the most brilliantly drafted note.
It fits very nicely. I don't understand any problem with it.
The letter should have said something like, Mr. Wargrave is content for us to implement the more liberal interpretation of the existing guidelines.
Why can you not tell Parliament what formula is being used even on a trial basis?
We didn't want to stir up a hornet's nest. And I'll say again, when Sir Richard said he'd had sleepless nights worrying about this, and I subsequently said I'd had sleepless nights too, after the collapse of the Matrix Churchill trial, and all this comes right to the fore, I looked at this, and others looked at this, and I remember talking to Sir Robin Butler, the Cabinet Secretary, about it at the time, saying, I don't remember changing the guidelines. Into the papers we dived and find actually that is not what happened.
You dive into the papers and you find that is not what happened. We have dived into the papers and we have seen that in practice that is what happened. I was now going to move on to what was said publicly. Lord Glenarthur says, we should continue to scrutinise rigorously all applications for export licences for the supply of defence equipment to Iraq and Iran.
Why is not the right answer to say there is the flexible interpretation, the flexible policy, call it what you like, in relation to Iraq?
Because it was judged there were overriding reasons of giving misleading information about tilts to one side or another, to put British citizens there at risk and all the rest of it.
Is it not a very healthy feature of a mature democracy that serious issues of this sort can be debated?
But it is also, Sir Richard, a definition of what a mature democracy means, I think, that it knows from time to time, in relation to foreign affairs, it is going to be necessary not for everything to be said in detail.
Mr. Barrett, you were in post at the Defence Export Sales Secretariat from June 1987 to September 1990. A Treasury official reported that the Ministry of Defence's Defence Export Sales Organisation was gung-ho to support sales of military equipment to Iraq and almost anywhere.
I think that is totally unjustified.
Also, Colonel Glazebrook of the Ministry of Defence had written, you commented that Alan Clark was gung-ho for defence sales. You agree you may have said something that implied that meaning. Is that right?
Yes, I do not dispute that at all. I cannot remember using those precise words. What does gung-ho mean?
I would take it as meaning very, very enthusiastic, perhaps double the verys. Very, very enthusiastic.
Yes, very enthusiastic.
What I would like to do now is come to your briefing for the ministerial meeting of the 23rd of December 1988. More disturbing intelligence coming to light. Press for a separate submission to go to the Prime Minister as she was involved last time. At that time, you clearly thought that the Prime Minister had been involved in the initial consideration of the Matrix Churchill lathes.
That is what I wrote at the time, yes. I would like at this stage to read what I have actually written in my present submission to you. I cannot now find any papers to corroborate the statement in the aid memoir I drafted then. I can only assume now that I was mistaken.
But in the 1988 aid memoir, you've referred to the Prime Minister twice in one paragraph. This is no casual dropping of the name in. I cannot imagine that you would casually drop the Prime Minister's name in. It seems to me that would be a rather peculiar thing to do.
I certainly did not make it up.
Mr. Clark, please, can I confirm that you were Minister of Trade at the Department of Trade and Industry from January 1986 to July 1989, and then Minister of State for Defence Procurement till April 1992?
That is correct, yeah.
We asked you to provide a general statement describing your role as Minister at the Department of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Defence. You say, "My general understanding, coloured possibly by some personal prejudice, is that it was my duty to promote, facilitate and give impetus to British exports and the industries from which they emanated." Can I then move on to the guidelines? You compare them to a Cheshire cat, and then you go on to say, "They were high-sounding, combining, it seemed, both moral and practical considerations, and yet imprecise enough to be overridden in exceptional circumstances."
Yes. I would argue that they illustrate the, and this is the kind of thing you could say about them, the constructive tension between positivism and ambiguity, a doctoral thesis of Professor Eyre. I mean, the whole of Guideline 3 is magnificent. We should not in future sanction any new orders which, in our view, would significantly enhance the capability of either side to prolong or exacerbate the conflict. Well, it's a brilliant piece of drafting, because it's far from being restrictive. It's open to argument in respect of practically every one of its elements. Well, I regard the guidelines as being so imprecise, so obviously drafted with the objective of flexibility in either direction, elasticity, shall I say, as to make them fair game. It denies the ordinary meaning of the English language to say the guidelines were not changed.
You say in your statement, "It must be understood that the guidelines were an extremely useful adjunct to foreign policy, offering a form of words elusive of definition. There was an understandable reluctance in Whitehall to stir up Parliament."
Yes. Well, House of Commons is a very volatile place, and you get rows and scenes and ooh on tape, and ministers have an aversion to this unless they're exhibitionists and like participating. Can I just add a small postscript? You must not ever lie to the House of Commons. If you do lie, what I find, normally, your resignation should follow immediately.
You say it is a matter of record that Guideline 3 remained. I'm not quite sure what you're saying.
One is now back to the slightly Alice in Wonderland suggestion, where I remember my former colleague, Mr. Waldegrave, said, because something was not announced, it had not happened. He was arguing that because it had not been announced, it could